Part 6. The War Ends. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radios across Japan and around the world, announcing surrender. For the Japanese women in American POW camps, this moment was apocalyptic. "We had been taught that the emperor would never surrender," Reiko said. "Never. Japan would fight until every man, woman, and child was dead. The emperor was divine. He couldn't admit defeat. But there was his voice. Most of us had never heard it before, telling us that Japan had lost." The camp commanders gathered all prisoners in the mess hall to hear the announcement. Some women understood enough English to grasp what was coming. Others needed translation. All were stunned. When they told us Japan had surrendered, several women fainted, Hanako recalled. Others screamed no over and over. Some just sat in silence, faces blank with shock. It felt like the world had ended. In a way, it had. The world we knew, the world we understood, was gone. The emotional responses varied wildly. Some women felt relief that the killing would finally stop. Others felt crushing shame that Japan had surrendered. Many worried about family members in Japan. "All I could think about was my mother and sisters," Michiko said. "Were they alive? Had the bombing killed them? Were they starving? I knew that if Japan had surrendered, conditions must be desperate. I couldn't eat for 3 days, thinking about my family suffering while I was safe in America." The camp staff showed unexpected sensitivity to the prisoners' emotional turmoil. They allowed the women time to grieve and process the news. Guards who normally enforced schedules let women skip work assignments if they were too upset. "Guard Ruth found me crying in the barracks," Yuki remembered. "She sat next to me and held my hand. She didn't say anything because what could she say? Her country had won. Mine had lost. But she sat with me in my grief. That's what I remember most, her hand holding mine." In the days following the surrender, more information emerged about Japan's condition. The atomic bombs, the destruction of cities, the millions dead, the complete devastation of the country. "When we saw pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we couldn't comprehend it," Sachiko said. "Entire cities gone, turned to ash. How could we fight against such power? How could anyone?" I understood then why the emperor had surrendered, not because he was weak, but because continuing meant the extinction of everyone in Japan. The news of the atomic bombs created complex emotions among the prisoners. Horror at the destruction, relief that it had ended the war, guilt that they were safe while their countrymen had died. "I felt angry at America for using such terrible weapons," Reiko admitted. "But I also felt angry at Japan for continuing the war until such weapons had to be used. And I felt guilty for being angry at Japan because that felt like betrayal. Everything was confused and painful." Father O'Brien, the chaplain, held a special service after the surrender announcement. He invited both American staff and Japanese prisoners. He spoke about peace, Hanako said, about how war makes everyone suffer, winners and losers alike, about how the work now was healing, not hurting, about how the human task was to find ways to live together. He prayed for everyone who had died, on all sides. It was the first time I heard someone acknowledge that suffering wasn't just happening to my people, but to everyone. It helped. As the initial shock wore off, a new fear emerged. What would happen to them now? The war was over. They were prisoners of a country that had utterly defeated theirs. Would they be executed as revenge? Kept as slaves? What did the future hold? "I thought maybe they had been kind to us during the war because they still needed to look civilized," Yuki said. "But now that they had won, maybe they would show their true nature. Maybe the kindness had been strategic, and now it would end." The camp commander, Colonel Matthews, called a meeting to address these fears. Through translators, he explained what would happen next. "He told us we would be repatriated, sent home to Japan," Michiko recalled. "He said it might take months to arrange because transportation was difficult and Japan was in chaos. But he promised we would go home. He also said that until then, our treatment would continue as before. We would be cared for, fed, protected. He said the war was over, and now the work of peace began." For many women, this promise was hard to believe. I kept thinking there must be a catch, Sachiko said. Why would they send us home? Why not keep us as prisoners forever, or execute us, or make us slaves? What country defeats an enemy and then just lets them go? It didn't make sense to me. But Colonel Matthews proved true to his word. Life in the camp continued as before. The food didn't get worse. The treatment didn't become harsh. If anything, the atmosphere relaxed. Guards who had maintained professional distance began to socialize more freely with prisoners. After the surrender, Ruth started joining us during lunch sometimes, Reiko said. She would practice her Japanese and we would practice our English. We talked about what we would do after we went home. She was going to go to college. I told her I hoped to teach again. She said I would make a good teacher. It was such a normal conversation. Two young women planning their futures. 6 months earlier, we had been enemies in a war. Now we were just two people hoping for a better life. The period between the surrender in August and repatriation beginning in late 1945 was strange. A liminal time when the women were still prisoners, but the war that had made them prisoners was over. We were in between, Hanako said. Not at war anymore, but not yet at peace. Still in America, but thinking about Japan. Still prisoners, but being treated almost like guests. It was a strange time. Some women struggled with anticipation of returning home. Would their families accept them? How would they be treated by other Japanese who hadn't surrendered? We heard stories of soldiers who returned home and were spat on by their own families, Michiko said. If that's how they treated soldiers, how would they treat us? Women who had been captured, who had lived with the enemy, who had learned the enemy's language. The American camp staff tried to prepare the women for repatriation. They provided information about conditions in post-war Japan and offered advice on how to handle potential prejudice. Colonel Matthews was honest with us, Reiko said. He told us that Japan was devastated, that food was scarce, that many people had lost their homes. He said some Japanese still believed the propaganda about prisoners being shameful. But he also said that Japan would need strong women to rebuild. He said our experiences, our survival, our strength, those were assets, not liabilities. He told us to be proud of who we were. Some women received letters from family members in Japan through the Red Cross. These letters provided the first direct news about their loved ones. When I got a letter from my mother saying she and my sisters were alive, I cried for an hour, Hanako said. She said our house had been destroyed in bombing, but they were alive. She said she prayed every day that I was safe, and now her prayers were answered. She said, "Come home, my daughter. Come home. Everything else can be rebuilt." Not all news was good. Many women learned that family members had died, killed in bombing, lost in battle, or dead from starvation and disease in the war's final desperate months. I learned that my brother had died in Okinawa, Yuki said quietly. He was 19, just a boy. The letter from my father was short. Your brother gave his life for the Emperor. We are proud. We are also thankful you survived. Please come home. That letter, with its mixture of grief and gratitude, helped me understand that I could mourn Japan's losses while still being grateful for my own survival. As autumn turned to winter, the first groups of prisoners began the journey home. The ships that had brought them to America reversed course, carrying them back across the Pacific to a homeland many barely recognized anymore. When it was finally my turn to leave, I felt strange, Reiko said. Part of me was desperate to go home, but part of me was sad to leave. I had made friends with some of the American staff. I had learned new skills. I had discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. The girl who arrived at this camp wasn't the woman who was leaving it. Part 7. Returning home. The journey back to Japan took nearly 3 weeks. The ships were crowded with repatriated prisoners, former soldiers and civilians alike, all heading home to an uncertain future. The atmosphere on the ship was completely different from when we traveled to America, Hanako recalled. Then, we had been terrified, expecting to be going to our deaths. Now, we were going home, but we were still afraid. Just a different kind of fear. As the ships approached Japan in late 1945 and early 1946, the women got their first glimpses of what the war had done to their homeland. When we sailed into Tokyo Bay, I couldn't believe what I saw, Michiko said. Or rather, what I didn't see. Whole neighborhoods were just gone, flattened, burned. Where there had been buildings and homes, there was nothing but rubble and ash. It looked like the surface of the moon. The port itself was crowded with American military ships and personnel. Japan was now under Allied occupation, primarily American. The sight of American soldiers on Japanese soil, American flags flying over Japanese buildings, was jarring. Part of me felt angry seeing American soldiers in Japan, Yuki admitted. This was our country, our home. But another part of me felt complicated. These were the same soldiers who had treated me well in the camps. How could I hate them when they had been kind to me? It was confusing. The repatriation process was organized but chaotic. Thousands of people were returning to Japan, prisoners of war, civilians who had been stranded in occupied territories, soldiers from disbanded units. Everyone was trying to find their families, their homes, their place in this new, defeated Japan. They gave us each a small amount of money, some food rations and papers identifying us as repatriated prisoners, Reiko said. Then they essentially set us loose. Figure it out yourselves. Find your way home if you still have homes to find. For many women, the journey to their family homes took days or weeks. Trains ran sporadically, roads were damaged, some towns and villages no longer existed. I walked for 3 days to reach my village, Sachiko said. The train only went part of the way because the tracks had been bombed. I walked past destroyed cities, burned fields, people living in makeshift shelters. I saw children begging for food. I saw old people who looked like skeletons. This was the Japan I had been fighting for? This devastation? The condition of the Japanese population shocked the returning women, even though they had seen pictures and heard reports. The reality was worse. Everyone looked so hungry, Hanako said. Thin, weak, their clothes were rags. Children had swollen bellies from malnutrition. Old people looked ancient because they had lost so much weight. I felt guilty for the weight I had gained in the American camp. I felt guilty for being healthy when everyone else was starving. When Reiko finally reached her village, she barely recognized it. Half the houses were gone, she said. The school where I had learned to fear Americans had been destroyed in a fire. The temple was damaged. The fishing fleet was mostly destroyed. Everything looked smaller, sadder, older. But when I saw my mother, none of that mattered. She ran to me and held me and cried. She kept saying, "You're alive, you're alive, you're alive." She didn't care about shame or honor. She only cared that her daughter had survived. Not everyone received such warm welcomes. Yuki's experience was more difficult. My father was glad to see me, but he was also distant, she said. He didn't want to talk about where I had been or what had happened. My aunt was worse. She said I should have killed myself rather than be captured. She said my presence brought shame to the family. My mother defended me, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was happy I was alive, but she also wondered if maybe my aunt was right. Some women faced outright hostility from their communities. I was refused a job at the school where I used to teach, Michiko said. The principal told me that parents wouldn't want their children taught by someone who had surrendered to the enemy. He said I was a bad example. I wanted to tell him about the American teachers who had treated me with more respect than he ever had. But I kept quiet. I needed to survive, and making enemies wouldn't help. Employment discrimination against former POWs was common. Many employers believed that people who had surrendered lacked the proper Japanese spirit and couldn't be trusted. I applied to 20 different jobs, Hanako said. Every time they learned I had been a prisoner of war, they rejected me. Never mind that I hadn't chosen to be captured. Never mind that I had nursing skills that Japan desperately needed. All that mattered was that I had surrendered. Or rather, that I had survived when I was supposed to die. Some women found ways around this discrimination by hiding their past. I never told anyone I had been in America, said Keiko, the woman who had given birth in the camp. As far as my neighbors knew, I had been in Manchuria when the war ended, and it took me months to get home. I hated lying, but I needed to protect my daughter. I didn't want her to grow up with the shame of having a mother who had been a prisoner. Others, however, found unexpected opportunities in post-war Japan. Reiko's English skills, learned in the camp, made her valuable to the American Occupation Administration. The Americans needed translators, she said, people who spoke both Japanese and English who understood both cultures. I was hired as a clerk in an American administration office. The pay was good, much better than most Japanese jobs at the time. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had better opportunities working for Americans in occupied Japan than I had ever had working for the Japanese government. The occupation itself created complex feelings among the returning women. On one hand, it was humiliating, Yuki said. Your country occupied by foreigners, American soldiers everywhere, having to follow rules made by the enemy. But on the other hand, the Americans were running things better than our own government had at the end. They brought food aid. They organized reconstruction. They tried to create a more democratic system. I hated needing their help, but I was grateful for it. As months passed, the women began to rebuild their lives in various ways. Hanako eventually found work as a nurse in a hospital run by American military doctors. The American doctors remembered that Japanese nurses had been trained well before the war, she said. They respected our skills even if Japanese employers didn't. Working there, I used everything I had learned in the camp. Michiko started a small business, using money she had saved from her American camp wages. I opened a shop teaching English, she said. Japanese people were hungry to learn English because the Americans were everywhere, and English skills meant better opportunities. I never told my students I had learned my English in a prison camp. I let them think I had studied formally. But every time I taught, I thought about Mary Tanaka and the kindness she had shown me. Sachiko became a teacher again, but it took years. At first, no school would hire me, she said. But there was a small English school run by Christian missionaries. They didn't care that I had been a prisoner. They cared that I could teach. I worked there for 3 years until attitudes started to change. Eventually, as Japan rebuilt and the occupation continued, people's views shifted. Being able to work with Americans became an asset instead of a liability. The women also had to navigate complex relationships with family members who had different war experiences. My cousin's husband had been a soldier who fought until the very end, Reiko said. He looked at me with such contempt. To him, I represented everything weak about the Japanese people, the willingness to surrender, to cooperate with the enemy, to survive rather than die gloriously. We barely spoke at family gatherings. He couldn't understand that survival took its own kind of strength.